Unit 15, Part 6. Let's move on to the hardest of the hard rules, universal generalization. Okay, think through what universal generalization allows you to do. It allows you to go from this propositional function is true of some individual, from an instance, to, because it's universal generalization, to the universal statement. This propositional function is true of all things. Okay, clearly this is a rule that requires restrictions. It will lead us astray if we do not restrict its use. Here is, well, the basic form of the rule is presented here. This is clearly an inference we want to block. This will be another inference we want to block, so we should construct our rules such that these inferences are not allowed. This is just, Dad is Australian, therefore all things are Australian, right? That's unfortunately not a valid inference, right? Just because the propositional function is true of some individual, therefore it's true of all things. That is what the rule allows you to do, but not unrestrictedly. It's clearly not valid, so we clearly need to restrict it. Another desideratum, another thing we desire from our restriction on the rule, is preventing this kind of inference. Okay, what we do here. So this is, there exists an X such that X is both Australian and a surfer. There are Australian surfers, to the conclusion that all things are Australian surfers. Note the form of this. This is not a categorical. It is a universal statement, but it's a universal. This is a conjunction, not a conditional, right? This is not in A or E or I or O form. Not a categorical. It says that all things are both Australians and surfers, right? So here is a proof that we might be allowed to do if, say, we didn't restrict the use of universal generalization, which we don't want to be able to do, right? There are Australian surfers, right? The existential statement. Existentially instantiate two. The individual A is Australian and surfer. Andrew is an Australian surfer. And then universally generalize from that to everything is an Australian surfer. So clearly we want to block that. So universal generalization is the other rule requiring restrictions, the other rule for which flagging will be involved. It's the harder of the hard rules. EI, existential instantiation, was the easier of the hard rules. The easier of the two hard rules, because when we went down and we did the existential instantiation, as we proceeded in our proof, we just wrote flag A, and that was it. Universal generalization is harder because it requires a bit more thinking ahead. Now, this is the hard generalization rule. Again, one of the instantiation rules is hard, one of the generalization rules is hard. It's EI is the instantiation rule that's hard. Universal generalization is the hard generalization rule. Remember, existential generalization is an unrestricted rule. If the propositional function is true of some individual, you're always entitled to infer that there exists some individual for whom it's true. Right? No restrictions needed for EG, but UG, right, where you're going to the universal, you're annexing the universal quantifier to some propositional function you've derived, to some singular statement you've derived, requires restrictions. The proper presentation, I should have the formal presentation of the rule. Okay, so let me read this important statement, which really states what we need for the rule. Okay, this is from 281, fourth paragraph. This is an important, very important statement from Klenk. The kinds of instances from which it is proper to infer universal propositions are those that would hold as well for any other individual. In practice, this usually means those that were derived entirely from universal propositions. Okay, so notice that conflicts with or rules out this one, right? Here, the instance from which we universally infer is an instance derived from an existential statement. We want to stop that. And we will stop that by having EI and EI, and UI is both flag rules, right? Remember this, to use EI properly, you can write flag A, and it's going to go to the proof. And the way we restrict the use of UI is going to prevent this kind of inference. So how do we restrict it? It's in the next paragraph that she refers to quarantining or isolating the individual. The individual for which we derive the instance, right, the singular statement from which we do the universal generalization. To guarantee that we have a genuinely universal instance, right, that is an instance that would hold just as well, for which what's true of that instance would hold just as well for any other individual. To guarantee that we have a genuinely universal instance from which it is legitimate to infer a universal proposition, we will require that the instance for UG, for universal generalization, be derived within a special kind of subproof. This is 281, which we will call a flagged subproof. The idea of the flagged subproof is to isolate The idea of the flagged subproof is to isolate the instance from unwanted outside influences, such as existential propositions and contingent singular statements, like Dan is Australia, thus ensuring that when we derive our instance, it will be one that depends only on statements that are true of everything, right? Universal statements. The flagged subproof, in other words, will serve as a kind of quarantine.